The monster walls of dirt. In the mid-1930s, the American Great Plains witnessed a terrifying meteorological phenomenon that looked like a biblical apocalypse. Colossal walls of black dust, some reaching over 200 meters into the sky, rolled across the flat horizon like a solid mountain range of pure, suffocating earth. These monster storms, known as black blizzards, moved with terrifying speed, completely erasing the sun and turning a bright, clear noon into a pitch-black midnight in a matter of seconds. The sheer visual impact was paralyzing. Ranch owners and school children could only watch in absolute horror as a heavy, dark cloud of ancient soil advanced to swallow their entire world, cutting off the air and leaving a thick, metallic taste of static electricity and dirt in their throats. It wasn't just a weather event, it was the atmosphere itself turning hostile against human survival. Chapter 2: The Suffocation Piles. Once the heavy winds died down, the true destruction was revealed beneath a heavy shroud of dust. The fine, powdery soil acted like dry snow, drifting violently against physical obstacles. Beautiful family farms and vintage vehicles were completely buried up to their roofs in massive piles of suffocating dirt. Entire roads disappeared, and wooden fences vanished beneath the new artificial desert landscape. The dust was so incredibly fine that it penetrated even the most tightly sealed homes, passing through keyholes and window frames. Inside, a thick layer of black grime coated dining tables, bed sheets, and family heirlooms, ruining everything. Families had to excavate their own front doors with shovels just to step outside, only to find their heavy tractors and farming equipment completely swallowed by the shifting dunes, transforming the once fertile heartland into a barren, ghostly graveyard of metal and wood. Chapter 3: The Dust Pneumonia Plague. The most terrifying aspect of the black blizzards was not the destruction of property, but the silent, biological assault on human lungs. The microscopic silica dust was sharp and toxic, cutting into respiratory tracts with every single breath. Soon, a deadly epidemic known as dust pneumonia swept across the interior of the United States, targeting infants, children, and the elderly. Hospitals filled to capacity, with doctors completely powerless against the internal suffocation. To survive the daily routine, citizens resorted to desperate measures, wearing primitive wet cloth masks, tying handkerchiefs over their faces, or even using surplus gas masks from the First World War. Red, swollen eyes and violent coughing fits became normal. The dust literally calcified inside the lungs, forming a heavy paste that choked victims from the inside out, turning a simple breath of fresh air into a luxury that money simply could not buy in the dynamic panic of 1935. Chapter 4: The Dead Livestock Scourge. As the soil turned into a violent weapon, the local animal population suffered a horrific fate. Cattle, horses, and wildlife were trapped in the open fields during the black blizzards with absolutely no shelter. The fine dust filled their eyes, blinding them permanently, and entered their stomachs as they tried to graze on the ruined, dirt-covered weeds. Thousands of animals dropped dead across the plains, their stomachs literally packed with pounds of solid mud. Archival records revealed devastating scenes of entire herds of cattle frozen in place, choked to death by the air, and slowly buried by the shifting dunes. The fields that once produced food were transformed into vast fields of bone and dried skin. This massive loss plunged farming families into deep starvation. As their livestock died, their crops withered into dust, and their entire financial survival was completely wiped out by the unforgiving plague of the shifting earth. Chapter 5: The Great Exodus. With their animals dead, their homes buried, and their children suffocating, millions of Americans reached their breaking point. They abandoned their ancestral lands in a massive, desperate migration known as the Great Okie Exodus. Families packed everything they owned onto old, fragile Model T trucks, strapping mattresses, wooden chairs, and metal cooking pots to the roofs and running boards. They hit the legendary Highway Route 66, escaping westward toward the promised land of California. The journey was grueling. Vehicles broke down constantly in the blinding heat and dust haze, and the roadsides were lined with temporary, filthy canvas tent camps. These refugees owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate hope for a future without dust. This migration reshaped the demographic fabric of America, born from the raw desperation of refugees fleeing an ecological nightmare that turned their homeland into a living hell. Chapter 6: The Ghost Towns of the Plains. The relentless onslaught of the black blizzards quickly broke the spirit of once thriving frontier communities, transforming bustling commercial centers into terrifying, silent monuments of dust. As the months dragged on with no rain, small farming towns across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas were completely abandoned by their inhabitants. Main streets that once echoed with the sounds of vintage cars, laughing children, and commerce became entirely silent, covered under deep, shifting waves of black soil. Wooden storefronts warped under the intense heat, and glass windows shattered, allowing the fine, powdery grime to claim the interiors of post offices, banks, and family grocery stores. Walking through these settlements felt like entering a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Signboards creaked violently in the heavy wind, doors swung open on rusted hinges, and the entire infrastructure was slowly swallowed by the dry earth. The algorithm of human progress had been completely reversed by nature, leaving behind nothing but a series of desolate, dark ghost towns, where the only remaining resident was the suffocating, howling wind of 1935. Chapter 7: The Starving Jackrabbit Plagues. As if the suffocating dust walls were not enough, nature unleashed an unexpected, terrifying biological plague upon the surviving residents of the Dust Bowl. With the natural vegetation completely wiped out by the extreme drought, millions of wild jackrabbits descended from the hills in a desperate search for food. These starving animals invaded the remaining farms in colossal, shifting carpets of fur, devouring everything in their path, including wooden fence posts, leather horse saddles, and the tiny dried roots of dead crops. To protect their remaining livelihoods, desperate communities had to organize massive, violent drives, using heavy wooden clubs to eliminate the pests by the thousands in heartbreaking fields of chaos. Shortly after the rabbits, clouds of millions of hungry grasshoppers arrived, so dense that they literally blocked out the remaining sunlight, eating the clothes off clotheslines and the handles off farming tools, proving to the terrified citizens that the land itself had become cursed. Chapter 8: The Static Electricity Monster. The constant friction of billions of tons of microscopic sand particles blowing through the dry air generated a terrifying invisible phenomenon: massive levels of static electricity. The voltage in the atmosphere became so incredibly high that it acted like an invisible monster terrorizing daily life. Massive blue electrical sparks would visibly leap from barbed wire fences directly into the ground during the height of the black blizzards. Touching a metal door handle or shaking hands with a neighbor could instantly knock a grown man unconscious with a violent shock. The electricity was so severe that it completely ruined the electrical systems of vintage cars, forcing drivers to drag heavy iron chains behind their vehicles to ground the current into the dirt road just to keep their engines running. Even Muino's de Vento generated blinding blue electrical arcs in the middle of the dark dust clouds, creating an eerie sci-fi atmosphere where even the simple act of touching an object could result in a painful, blinding burn. Chapter 9: The Government Scorched Earth Auctions. As financial ruin consumed the Great Plains, the structural reality of the Great Depression struck with brutal force. Unable to pay their taxes or mortgages to distant, cold-hearted banks, thousands of families faced the ultimate humiliation: forced foreclosure auctions. Government officials and local sheriffs arrived on buried farmyards, triggering papers of eviction to the weathered wooden doors of ancestral homes. Entire lives were spread out across the dusty grass to be sold for mere pennies to cynical out-of-town buyers. Cherished family Bibles, iron beds, workhorses, and heavy tractors or sold off under the gray, dust-choked sky, while mothers and crying children watched from the back of old trucks. These heartbreaking events often turned tense and violent. Desperate neighbors sometimes formed defensive rings, holding shotguns to force the auctioneers to sell the items back to the original family for a single penny, a desperate act of communal survival against a system that cared nothing for their suffering.
Chapter 10: The Unforgiving Legacy. By the late 1930s, the rain slowly returned, and the colossus walls of black dirt finally vanished into the history books, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a generation defined by survival. The concrete bunkers of the bootleggers were gone, and the black blizzards of the Dust Bowl were over. But this raw, lawless struggle against a hostile environment and corrupt systems didn't begin in the 20th century. The relentless desperation, the armed standoffs, and the dark secrets of survival were actually born decades earlier, in the unedited, blood-soaked dirt towns of the American frontier. Long before the farmers fought the dust, the lawless outlaws and dangerous outcasts of the Wild West fought each other with cold steel and gunpowder. Click on the video on your screen right now to unlock our deepest historical case file and discover the terrifying, unedited photos of the 1880s Old West saloons that your school books completely hid from you. Enter the Frontier Archive,